Welcome to Music History Monday for March 4th, 2024. I'm Bob Greenberg, and the title for today's podcast is Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake and Some Myths Debunked. If you haven't already, please consider joining me on my subscription site at patreon.com/RobertGreenbergMusic, where I blog, vlog, podcast, pontificate, review, and bloviate 4 to 6 times a week. We mark the first performance of the ballet Swan Lake on March 4th, 1877, 147 years ago today. Premiered at the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow with music by Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, 1840 to 1893, choreography by the Czech-born dance master Julius Reisinger, 1828 to 1892, and its music performed by the Bolshoi Theater Orchestra. The first performance of Swan Lake landed with an epic thud, meaning not good. Pretty much every aspect of the ballet was critically blasted. The vast majority of the critics present found Tchaikovsky's score to be far too complex for a ballet. One critic called it, quote, too noisy, too Wagnerian, and too symphonic, unquote. A visiting correspondent by the name of Tyler Grant called the ballet, quote, utter hogwash, unimaginative, and altogether unmemorable, unquote. Now, admittedly, there were some problems with that premiere performance. For example, the famed Russian prima ballerina Anna Sobishchanskaya, 1842 to 1918, was originally cast in the role of Odette, the White Swan, the star and heroine of the ballet. She may also have been slated to dance the role of the villainous Black Swan, Odile. Today it is common practice for the same ballerina to perform the parts of both Odette and Odile. However, it is now believed that the ballet had originally called for 2 different dancers to dance the parts. Whatever the case, the Bolshoi's prima ballerina, again Anna Sobishchanskaya, was to star in the original production of Swan Lake. And then, out of the blue, she was suddenly removed from the cast and replaced by an entirely inferior dancer named Pelagaya Karpakova, who was also known as Polina Karpakova. What happened? Apparently, a major figure in the Russian government, who has remained nameless over the years, a testament to his power, had Sobishchanskaya blackballed, or black swanned, as it were, and bounced from the ballet. This government bigwig and Sobishchanskaya had been having an affair. Yes, seedy but true. This is how ballet worked in France and Russia, where aristocrats took as their lovers ballerinas. And he had rewarded her prowess in the sack and loyalty towards him with some very expensive jewelry. Having received the jewelry, Madame Sobishchanskaya turned around and married a fellow dancer and sold the bling for cash. A lot of cash, leaving her erstwhile fat cat boyfriend unhappy. And so it was up to a lesser and likely under-rehearsed dancer to negotiate the virtuosic part of Odette at the premiere, a part that had been created for Anna Sobishchanskaya. As the replacement, Pelagaya Karpakova's performance did not go well. Then there were the issues surrounding the score Tchaikovsky composed for this, his first ballet. He was frankly an odd choice to be commissioned by the Imperial Theaters in 1875 to compose Swan Lake. Okay, He was an accomplished composer with 3 symphonies under his belt. But in Russia, ballets were usually composed by specialists who wrote nothing but dance music. Such dance music was generally characterized by glaringly obvious and easily followed pa type rhythmic accentuation, tricked out with simple melodies set in even phrases. Well, along came Tchaikovsky, who composed for ballet the way he composed for the symphony hall, writing music in which the groupings of beats were not always obvious and phrases that were not always even. Music replete with counter-melodies and polyphony, thematic development, and long-range key relationships. Music that did not merely accompany the dancers, but that deepened the dramatic and emotional action being depicted on stage. Tchaikovsky did not set out to be a revolutionary when it came to Russian ballet music, but that's what he was. And it was only after his death that his symphonic ballets came to be acclaimed as the compositional masterworks that they are. But in his lifetime, Tchaikovsky's ballet scores were considered to be problematic. Then there was the conductor at the premiere, Stepan Ryabov. Tchaikovsky's score was much more difficult to perform than the ballet music the Bolshoi Theater Orchestra was accustomed to, and the orchestra musicians did what orchestra musicians will do under like circumstances. They misbehaved badly. The conductor, Stepan Ryabov, who is referred to in the literature as a semi-amateur, could neither fathom Tchaikovsky's score nor control his naughty players. By every account, the orchestra played abysmally at the premiere performance. And finally, there was the story itself, a German folktale that was not likely to arouse Russian audience sympathy in the 1870s. We are told that Swan Lake's German origins were, quote, treated with suspicion, while the tale itself was regarded as stupid, with unpronounceable surnames for its characters, unquote. Given all of these issues, it's easy to see why Tchaikovsky, whose music took the brunt of the criticism leveled at Swan Lake, was largely able to write that criticism off. According to his brother, Modeste, quote, the poverty of the production, meaning the decor and costumes, the absence of outstanding performers, the ballet masters, meaning the choreographers, weakness of imagination, and finally the orchestra. All of this together permitted Tchaikovsky, with good reason, to cast the blame for the failure on others, unquote. But still, how are we to understand the initially awful critical response to Tchaikovsky's most famous and beloved ballet? By remembering that at the time of its first performance, Swan Lake was new music, and nothing confuses the bejesus out of an audience more than new, meaning unfamiliar music. That's how it has always been, and likely always will be. But, some might sputter in response, weren't composers like Tchaikovsky the rock stars of their time, and their music the popular music of their time? It's all a myth. Let's talk. Rock stars. Allow me to address these issues with as much dispatch as possible. A rock star is a famous rock and roll performing musician who sells their music with a stereotypical persona heavy on flamboyance and sexuality, either implicit or overt. Admittedly, the term rock star has come to represent more than just musicians, but highly accomplished and well-known people in any field, from sports to cooking to music history and composition. But for now, let's just stick with the original rock musician usage of the term. In our desire to identify with musicians of other times and other places, we, as a general public, have come to use the phrase rock star indiscriminately and quite misleadingly. How many times have we heard from some well-meaning but ultimately clueless individual that, quote, Mozart was the rock star of his time, unquote? Please, read my lips. No, he was not. Not even close. The rock stars of Mozart's era, if we should even allow ourselves to call them that, were the famed Italian castrati of the 18th century, those gelded male singers who dominated the opera stages of Europe, who made scads of money, who dressed and acted outrageously, and whose singing induced frenzy in their audiences, and whose personas and lives gripped the imagination of the public. As for the 19th century, the only concert musicians we could justifiably call rock stars would be the violinist and composer Niccolo Paganini, 1782 to 1840, and the pianist and composer Franz Liszt, 1811 to 1886. Here's another myth I wish I had a 5-spot for every time I've had to hear it. Quote, Mozart's was like the popular music of its time, unquote. No, it was not. And once again, not even close. In fact, even compared to composers like J.C. Bach, Joseph Haydn, and Antonio Salieri, Mozart's music wasn't particularly popular at all. On the contrary, his mature music was considered by most of his audience to be too complicated, too artful, meaning overwritten, and much too demanding for the average listener. He was considered to be a composer for connoisseurs, and with but a few exceptions, like his opera Singspiel, The Magic Flute, certainly not a composer for the general music-going public. That Mozart's music is now embraced for being the gloriously beautiful and accessible body of work it is considered today is a testament to the fact that we've had 233 years since his death to get to know it and become accustomed to it. The fact is, popular music as we understand it today is a mass media-driven music industry that didn't even come into existence until the advent of recording in the very late 19th century. Back then, to Pyotr Tchaikovsky and his ballet, Swan Lake. Was Tchaikovsky a rock star of his time? No. Was Tchaikovsky's music the popular music of its time? It was not. In fact, as we have just seen apropos of his ballet Swan Lake, a work considered by most to be the single greatest ballet score in the repertoire, it was, at the time it was first produced and heard, critically scorned by Tchaikovsky's own hometown Moscow audience. Tchaikovsky. Background. He was born and raised in Votkinsk, a village about 600 miles east of Moscow in the foothills of the Ural Mountains. While Votkinsk might have been in the sticks, Tchaikovsky grew up in a cultured upper-middle-class household. He was a delicate, oversensitive child who early on became obsessed with music to the degree that the adults around him considered it unhealthy. The stories are legion. He would rush to the piano immediately after school, refusing to do anything else, like play outside with the other kids. He would drum his fingers on any available surface, driving everyone else in the house crazy. At the age of 6, he fled from the family's living room during a music hall. 2 hours later, his governess, a woman named Fanny Durbach, found him in his bedroom, sprawled on his bed, crying hysterically. His words, as Fanny later recalled them, quote, "Oh, the music, he sobbed. "Save me from it, Fanny! Save me! It's here! In here!" He struck his forehead. "And it won't leave me in peace!" Unquote. 6 years old? I'd immediately have had the kid evaluated. His governess, Fanny Durbach, referred to him as a child of glass. So easily was his delicate spirit chipped and even broken. At the age of 10, hoping to make a man of him, Tchaikovsky's parents sent him to boarding school at the School of Jurisprudence in St. Petersburg. He graduated in 1859, just shy of his 19th birthday, and took a job as a clerk first class, preparing documents at the Department of Justice in St. Petersburg. Tchaikovsky had kept up with his music while in school, practicing piano and going to concerts and operas, and so it should come as a little surprise that, bored to death with his job, he ignored his family's disapproval and in September of 1862 enrolled in the very first class at the spanking new St. Petersburg Conservatory. On graduating in 1866, he accepted a job as professor of music theory at the now spanking new Moscow Conservatory. It was in Moscow where Tchaikovsky lived and worked from 1866 until 1878 that he came into his musical maturity and thus became that rarest of contemporary musical birds, a Russian composer who from the very beginning of his career was well schooled in the basics of music composition and the Western European repertoire. Surrounded as he was by xenophobic Russian nativists, Tchaikovsky was a genuine musical cosmopolitan. His native Slavic temperament, coupled with his German-style training, were both powerfully influenced by his love for Italian opera, French ballet, and the music of Wolfgang Mozart. Put it all together, and you have a composer who could write as beautiful a tune as anyone who ever lived, someone who wore his emotional heart on his sleeve, and yet was able, most of the time, to shape and discipline his musical ideas using time-honored Western European compositional techniques. Swan Lake. This information about Tchaikovsky's compositional proclivities is extremely germane to his first ballet, Swan Lake, which was composed between August of 1875 and April of 1876. In fact, it's germane to all three of Tchaikovsky's ballets, Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty of 1889, and The Nutcracker, 1892, not one of which was successful in Tchaikovsky's lifetime. That's because, for reasons we observed earlier, his ballet scores were not considered at the time to be proper ballet music. Swan Lake tells the story of a beautiful princess, the white swan named Odette, who has been enchanted by an evil sorcerer named von Rothbart. By day, she is the queen of the swans, all of whom are similarly enchanted maidens, who together swim in a lake of tears. That would be the actual Swan Lake. Only at night does Odette return to her human form. Odette falls in love with the young, adorable Prince Siegfried. She tells him that she can be free of her curse if he will pledge to her his love. But before he can do so, von Rothbart intervenes. He sends his own evil daughter, Odile, the Black Swan, disguised as Odette, to steal him away. Intrigue, mistaken identity, and confusion follow. In the end, depending upon the version of the story being danced, evil either succeeds, bummer, or fails. Okay then. As we previously observed, Odette/Odile is today a dual role, which means that it is danced by the same ballerina. It is the supreme role, the one young ballerinas dream about, crazy, difficult to perform, and a challenge for even the most elite dancers. Tchaikovsky's complete score for Swan Lake runs well over 2 hours in length. Concert performances and most recordings will feature selections from the ballet, Swan Lake's greatest hits, as it were. While we as listeners are indeed most accustomed to the selections or suite version of Sleeping Beauty, I would assert that the full score is glorious. But many of those very things that make the full score glorious for us today, its compositional integrity as a singular work, its complex rhythmic and harmonic language, its developmental and often polyphonic writing, were precisely those aspects of the score that were lost on its first night audience. We can only wish that the unfortunate, supremely oversensitive, prone to weeping and to self-loathing Tchaikovsky could see how we respect and adore his music today. Some would say that there's nothing wrong with posthumous appreciation, but in this I would beg to disagree. Because while audience appreciation inspires a composer and makes their professional life infinitely easier to live, posthumous appreciation is bupkis. Too little, way too late. Thank you. To sample and download one or all of my many courses on subjects musical produced by the Great Courses / The Teaching Company, please visit my website at robertgreenbergmusic.com.